All right, board, one of the next order on the agenda is our working group reports, and we got that till lunch and then after lunch, and we're going to break for lunch at 11:30. I just want y'all to know we're going to have an hour of this and we'll take back up. One of the things I would like to propose in this thing is I don't think we're going to have a lot of working group talk or describe, and I'd like to take this time to maybe work a little bit on doing some concepts and ideas for our recommendations that we will finally formulate and put out at according to the schedule at 4:30. So if y'all don't have any problems with that, and because I think a lot of your all's recommendations you're going to make was a direct result of your working group. So if that meets with everybody's approval, we'll just go right into it. And so one of the things that I don't know what to do at this point about who goes first or what goes what or like that. So Ginger had mentioned to me that she had a couple of items she'd like to bring up, so I'll just go to her.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These are really very small things in the scope of things. A couple of points and recommendations that I'd like for you to consider. We've had some conflicts between wild horses and burros and trucks and cars and so forth, east of Bullhead City where my brother lives, and in other places in Wyoming and so forth. And in Wyoming, they've used something called a streeter light. And these are small reflectors, and it's S-T-R-E-I-T-E-R. They're small reflectors on posts that are on the sides of the highway on both sides. The concept is that particularly the conflicts occur dawn, dusk, and at night. And when the headlights of a truck or car hit the light, it creates cross beams that go across, and it has the effect of deterring wildlife to cross there. They're being used, and there have been studies done on this that my office has, if that's important to you. And they're being used in Wyoming, and I drive, of course, this to the Priors. I drive through Wyoming on a regular basis. And so from roughly Worland area, Wyoming, Thermopolis to Worland, Worland to Basin. This is a long stretch in the it's big open country, but there's a lot of conflict that has happened. Also, south of Grand Teton National Park, they use streeter lights. So I would like to recommend that we suggest to BLM that they review where there are conflicts with wildlife, including burros and horses, and look into using this tool, which I think is very modestly priced, to avoid collisions and damage to both humans and to animals.
I don't know if that's something that is feasible or allowed, because you're talking about state highways, and BLM has no
jurisdiction there.
Over
well,
highway.
what I think that BLM could do is, since particularly east of Bullhead City is BLM land, it's the Black Rock Desert Burro Range on both sides of the street. But they could interface, of course, as they do on a regular basis, with state and local governments on this.
Well, okay, that's something that we can talk about. Okay, what else?
Have you? Okay. All right. Well, these are concepts.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is something that Barry and I briefly discussed, and we love what Gus has done as far as signage on Anarchy. Having that kiosk with some of the rules of the trail, and also those plastic sticks that have also rules on there: don't feed, don't get within 100 feet, and also they let the public know where they are, and they let the public know that they are in a herd management area managed by the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service. I think Forest Service could utilize this as well. We raise the awareness that these are wild horses that you're seeing, They're not domestic horses. And it also will increase, I believe, tourism and maybe help some of the smaller communities that are around areas that people don't know what they're seeing, or they don't know that they've even passed a wild horse herd area. In one of the small communities in Colorado, Maybell, they have a sign right outside of town that says, you know, that you're entering wild horse country and so forth. And there's good signage at Sandwash, if anybody's been to Sandwash Basin. I think some of you folks have. But it can help promote the economic opportunities for wild horse viewing, and it'll benefit the community. So I would like to see BLM do this in all the herds where they can identify that you're entering a wild horse herd area, and here's the rules of watching and behaving in wild horse
Well, I'm
country.
sure there's a minimum standard, but each state stands alone. I mean, our role as the board is to make broad recommendations from 30,000 feet, not getting exactly in that. And Bruce, isn't there a regulation that requires signage? Don't you have on your HMAs and things of this nature?
I'm not sure what you mean, require
No,
signage.
Signage to say, this is BLM land, this is BLM rules.
I mean, typically when people enter public lands, they see typically a lot of signs. They'll say, you know, you're entering the lands managed by the so-and-so field office. You know, and I think it's still up. I think it's those HMAs that have high accessibility to the public probably already have kiosks in them. I think, you know, again, familiarize with myself with remember what state I'm from, Colorado. I mean, we have kiosks in Sandwash Basin out there, and but I think that's the only one. Or well, Little Bookless has a huge. Yes. The Friends of the Mustang group there has developed a large structure there, and that educates on the wild horse story.
Okay.
So it varies.
In Wyoming specifically, there's great opportunity for this. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. There's great opportunity north of Rollins, for instance, the route to Riverton. There's a number of herds that you pass along the way, and that would be very beneficial. I think Stewart Creek, Green Mountain. Green Mountain has a small sign that says it's Green Mountain at least. But herds where people are driving down the highway, and I've been in the motel there in Rollins, and people are going, yeah, I saw some horses. And the owner of the hotel, in fact, said, well, those are wild horses. And they said, oh, really? Yeah, oh, I didn't know that. So I think we create an appreciation and a more enjoyable trip if you know that long stretch has wild horses that you're looking at.
I think we could, I mean, I don't know what the other, but we could probably do something along the lines of encouraging BLM to promote stuff like that. But as far as mandating they do A, B, C, and D, I don't think that we can.
I think you included as part of a marketing strategy that we all discussed here earlier. You know, we had marketing was a big emphasis or push for the Bureau in order to meet some of those goals that they put out, and I think that'd be a part of a marketing strategy. You could certainly put that message there.
To promote.
I think and I agree, it is marketing. And in the long run, it's also about adoption. If people get used to seeing horses and they go, wow, those Stewart Creek horses are really cool, I'd like to have one of those someday. So it's an incentive to adopt.
I agree. Okay, we can talk about that later. Okay. Ben, you have anything you want to bring up? No recommendation or anything like that? Okay. All right. Stephen? We may get to go to lunch early. My goodness.
Sorry. Yesterday, there was presented to us by Alan Shepard, the on-range branch chief, a set of options that were presented to Congress. There were 4 different options that were presented to Congress that BLM spent a lot of time and money in drafting, and I think that as a board we need to find one that we can stand behind and support and tell Congress, you know, this is the option that the board supports.
Okay, so you're referring to the 4 options, A, B, C, and D, that he presented yesterday then?
Yes.
Okay. I think so too. I think we need to think about that, and we can talk about it after lunch a little bit further. Let us think about it a little more, but come up with an option. I think that's great. I think that's a good idea.
I think it would be beneficial for everyone on the board, maybe an hour during lunch, whenever you're having a moment, to kind of review those and look it over and kind of see what, as you study it, what you think would be the best viable option. Because I know BLM put a lot of thought and effort into this, and I think we ought to support them in this.
Good idea. Good idea. Was there anything in yours and Celeste's working group that y'all come up with?
I think just general overall support for the BLM continuing to, they were given a marketing survey which advised them to do some branding work and get some consistency between and among their adoption events, and to sort of raise the level of professionalism and have to train volunteers and things of that nature, just so that when you show up at an event, you know exactly what to expect. Those then implementing the solutions in a very, very, very comprehensive plan that they were given is going to take some resources and time, and I think the board needs to be supportive of that, so that the adoption program can continue its forward progression in being successful.
In what way? What areas? What type of?
I think that we should be supportive of that. Part of that marketing plan called for subcontracting out some portions of that entire program. That's going to be expensive and going to require RFPs and that whole thing. And
You're talking about the Great Lake marketing report.
Correct.
That we got.
And
that was a very interesting report.
Yeah.
There was a lot of things
It was.
there. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that having come from, oddly enough, strangely, I shouldn't have ever had this job, but a marketing background for a very short period of time, oftentimes what will happen is that marketing study is done and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
And it is expensive to carry forth with the recommendations in that report. And sometimes what happens is agencies will hand pick from that. Obviously, the low-hanging fruit is going to happen first that they can do within. But I think we need to be very supportive of making sure that they actually complete that project.
Do you think that every aspect of that marketing survey should be implemented, or you think they need to cherry pick the ones that apply to the best? Or
I think that they should be relying on a subcontractor to help them in making those decisions. I don't think they have the expertise to make that call, but I think that people do.
Do you think that we could, just the recommendation we could make as a board could be to implement the Great Lakes research project?
Well, so it's a little hazy. They've begun implementation of it, and so just making sure that we're backing the continuation of that implementation. I fear with projects like this that they sort of reach a sort of top-out point, and then we've sort of run out of money at this point, and then everything that you've done down the line doesn't
money
matter.
is a limiting factor. We have to admit that. Maybe y'all could develop something along the lines that implemented, to continue doing something along continue supporting or applying or whatever aspects of that report that they can, that's feasible, that's economically feasible or something like that.
Okay.
Okay.
Let me tweak some wording on
Yeah,
that.
no, I think, for those of the board that wasn't there, the BLM started in 2016. They did a marketing survey, and it was a real good, and Holly gave everybody one of those the other day. Great Lakes Marketing Survey, and there's a lot of information in there that is just incredible, that makes tons of sense, and it's things that I hadn't even thought about when I read it. I mean, it was, you know, we've had problems in the past with marketing, and there's been a lot of work done along this, and this report was a result of just that right there, us asking questions and everybody asking questions and BLMing out how we could do a better job of marketing these horses, because a Mustang is a great horse, and promoting that and pushing that. And it's a remarkable thing within the BLM is that you have autonomous states and you have the whole eastern states. I think there's 30-something states east of the Mississippi that's in the eastern states. And each one of them have tried to come up with their own marketing plan and to promote and do all this stuff. And I think the result of this was to try to put everybody together, and it's incredible. And so coming up with a recommendation that as many of those that are economically feasible to apply, something along those lines. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay, all right, okay, good enough. Was there anything else that y'all come up with?
In that working?
Yep.
I don't think so. We were really encouraged by some of the things that the board or that has the BLM has already implemented. They've talked about it earlier in the meeting with being able to increase the number of horses that an individual can purchase from 4 to 25. I think that really opens the door for a lot of willing people who'd like to make a go at training wild Mustangs. Also, we're encouraged by the BLM's making an incentive to make it easier. I don't know if we came up with a recommendation, but there has been some good discussion about whether $1,000 is the right amount. But I definitely think it's a step in the right direction, and maybe when we have the recommendations, there might be something that comes if we want to see that increased.
Well, that's a budget amount, and I know Holly spoke up where they come up with it, but in 2015, when that was a board recommendation that they do that $1,000 was about what tip trainers were getting. And what it was, we wanted the tip to be, I mean, if I tip my own horse, I needed to get the same thing. I mean, if you know what I'm saying? TIP is a trainer incentive program through the Mustang Heritage Foundation. So
well, maybe it'd be wise to just leave it where it's at, but we are very encouraged by some of the new approaches that are being looked into by the BLM.
Well, I mean, last year they found homes for 4,600 horses. That's a lot more than what we have had. I mean, that is a very steep climb. Very steep climb. Celeste?
To add on to the newer sales policy that Stephen's referring to, and Nancy brought it up in her presentation, there is some concern on behalf of some of the groups that it's perhaps maybe the only problem is that it's written unclearly. And so if we could have some direction for, I'm not sure how to say this, clarifying it and making sure that it is abundantly evident that any loophole or perceived loophole is closed. I think that would go a long way towards.
You know, and I'm being very honest and very upfront when I address this like this, is that you know, the glass is half full, it's not half empty. Just because one person did something wrong, it shouldn't be held against everybody else or assume everybody else is. And that really upsets me, that if I go and I'm assumed that I'm going to do something bad with those horses, I'm gonna say, well, pardon me, but to hell with you, I'll just go buy me some quarter horses. You see what I'm saying? And I'm being very honest. It's up to that person on the field that's making that decision, whether or not them horses go or not, to make the best decision they can with the information they have. I mean, if a guy comes up in a trailer and it's got plywood on the floor and it's got cattle panels on the side where it's rusted out, you know, and you look at him and he says, I'm going to train 25 horses. I want to, you know. Well, no. You know, I mean, that's up to that person in the field to do that. And the problem that bothers me is that when the Bureau of Land Management makes a decision based on the best information that they have, and they're covering everything, they're covering 50 states. And then when somebody that brings it on a more personal level because of a terrible instance, and you know, and it's one of those things. But me judging somebody because someone else made a mistake is not the right way to handle things. There has to be trust. There has to be confidence among this. I mean, if you're looking like that, then nobody should have a driver's license because we may have a wreck on the way home. That is more of a chance of you having a wreck driving home than someone else doing something else with these horses.
But we're not on that panel, so we don't have to talk about it.
No, but you may have to vote on a recommendation.
This is very true. Well, perhaps I'll work on a little bit of that wording that might be amenable to discussion.
Okay, you know, I would have no problem with clarifying that a little bit, but I do have problems with prejudging people based on one person.
I do too.
I mean, but you want to do it, so you know that's all I have a problem with. Was there anything else that y'all want to bring up from your all's working group?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
If I could.
Yo, go ahead. Yes, help yourself.
You know, I think one of the things that we have to keep in perspective on that whole discussion about the adoption, liberalizing the adoption numbers and whatnot, if we had a corral full of horses that we had options with, you know, with what's left over, I'd say this would be a much more of a relevant conversation. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but it'd be more relevant. But, you know, we're looking at 70,000 horses, and on that we're looking to we're trying to give recommendations of what we're going to do with them. We're also talking about populations that are doubling every 4 years, and I think the 800-pound gorilla in the room is we don't know what we're going to do with all these horses. And I would just say to the board and to everybody that's out there, we need to be looking for solutions to allow for more adoptions out there on the ground. And I'm not saying we give them away to people that are going to slaughter them. That's not my point at all. I'm just saying is that it comes back to what our chairman just said, is I think we need to assume best intentions on people until they prove us wrong. And yes, there are going to be problems out there that we're going to have to deal with down the road. But I think clarifying what the consequences are if you do violate the rule or the law, I think is a good start, and I think it's a place where we should go with it. But I do believe we should do what we can to increase adoptions so that we can get more of them off of that long-term holding side. Okay.
I wasn't on the board when the $1,000 incentive plan was initiated, but are there good procedures in place to follow up on those horses to make sure that they're not eventually abused or neglected?
Generally speaking, when all I can refer to is tip. I mean, well, and you can do this on the wild horses too. When they had the plan that they've got is when they go and adopt that horse, they get $500. Mm-hmm. Now they take that horse. They don't own that horse for a year. Okay, and then at the end of the year, generally in that time, an BLM employee will go out and look to be sure that the horse is maintained, that everything is X, Y, and Z like it should. And at the end of the year, they can get the other $500. Mm-hmm. Now, I've been a tip trainer for a long time, and when someone comes to me to look at one of my tip horses, if I get the least indication, that horse is already spoken for. Mm-hmm. You know. And that, but now I can't say every tip trainer is that way, but I'm just going about me. I can tell you where every one of my tip horses are. I can tell you who has them. I can tell you what they're doing. And I'm talking, the last count was 76 of them. I can tell you where every one of them are. And it's, and so there is that requirement now on an SA horse, a sale eligible horse, a sale authority horse. There isn't any follow-up on that. So, but what they're referring to on this, in this bonus incentive, is there's a year from the time they pick up that horse till the time they get it. So yeah, there's, you know, and I don't think anybody's gonna keep a horse, I mean, for a year and not.
Take care of it.
Yeah.
I mean, those of us that get called out by the sheriff or the local humane group to look at these horses, to evaluate, not these horses, but horses in general, to look at them to see if they've been abused and so forth. So it always worries me that perhaps some of these folks are taking the horses for the money and not for the horse, right? So
Right.
a year is a long time, so I think you probably pick up those
You'd
type
pick up real
folks.
quick, plus the field staff going out there
Yeah,
too.
but I wonder if it wouldn't hurt randomly to pick a few of them out a year and just drop around 2 or 3 years later to see what's going on.
Well, but
It's a
they,
resource issue, I'm sure,
but they don't have any authority.
after they've signed them over.
After they're titled,
Yeah.
they are their horse.
Okay.
And so it's yeah. Ginger?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I think to increase adoptions, back to the increasing adoptions, it's no fluke that there's a higher adoption rate in the horses, in the herds that are known. And so, back to the signage, but there are other things, you know, I think we can do to put a wild face on the adoption program. And that is for people to know where their horse came from. And so if they visited a range and so forth, and then they have a roundup, the adoption rates go up if the herd is known. And I've been around for a long time with this program. I've spoken to thousands of people all over the country, and I know that that's true.
Well, that's
truth.
that's very true, because I mean groups, you know, and get together, and I mean there's folks that want horses from that HMA because they've had horses in the past, you know. So that's very true, and one of the things that we have done, and BLM has done, there's a lot of horses that were born in holding, and they never would keep up with where that colt was from. You know, they just let it run with its mama, and then when they got ready to wean, it wouldn't have a brand on it. There's a lot of horses out there that have Oklahoma brands. I mean that, you know, but they were from a horse that was caught from the wild, and so that lineage is not there. Well, there's been a lot of work. BLM has done a lot of work to change that, where that horse, that if it's born in captivity, gets the same number brand as its mama, to keep that line. And you know, it's like buying a Ford or buying a Chevy or buying a Dodge. You know, if you go in and a truck don't have any emblem on it at all, and it's part Dodge and part Chevy, well, what kind of truck is it? Well, and there's folks that really care about that. I mean, the Kiger herd, or your Pryor Mountain herd, you know. And me, I'm kind of partial to Wyoming horses. I've had a whole bunch of them, and so it's like everything else. And so that is a good. I mean, that's great. That's great. And that's good. Anything else that you had from your all's group? Okay. Tom?
All right. Let me get my notes up. So, the Population Growth Suppression Working Group, we had a really interesting meeting, I thought. We reviewed the on-range and holding population numbers and the gather numbers over the last few years. It looks like Nevada has the greatest number of horses, with over 40,000 horses and 3,600 burros, and we've reviewed the total number here plenty of times, so I'm not going to go over that. Removal numbers increased in 2018 from a previous 6-year average of around 4,300 animals up to 9,500 animals. Contraceptive vaccine use in the last 3 years averaged around 352 doses per year of PZP, 275 doses per year of PZP-22, and around 14 doses per year of Gonacon. And it was discussed and estimated that Spain would probably create the greatest reduction in the short range and full numbers. So after reviewing the fertility use or the contraceptive use and the gatherings, it's pretty obvious, I think, at least to that group, and it should be to everybody, that removals and fertility interventions are not making much of a dent towards sustainable population. We also reviewed the current research projects, and there's some promising results with the use of Gonacon, followed by a booster, as well as the use of Y-shaped IUDs. So this is not a formal recommendation, but our recommendation that we can discuss is to first focus resources on getting down to an MAL within the next 3 to 5 years by using removals primarily. This can be accomplished and accommodated by off-range holdings. And to also consider adding on-range euthanasia purely from a welfare perspective, or to decrease pain and suffering in herds that are suffering due to dehydration and or starvation. We believe that, or the consensus was, once at AML, once that use has been achieved, a combination of current contraceptives, sterilization, sex ratio adjustments, and removals should be able to maintain herds at an acceptable level.
Comments, board? How do you think that would, so you're talking about when they are gathered, if they have some genetic defects, clubfooting, things of that nature?
No.
No?
No, we're talking about in the situations where you have herds of horses or family groups where there's severe situation due to water shortage or starvation, that rather than capturing those horses, perhaps on-range euthanasia. Well, on-range euthanasia would be much better from a pure welfare perspective, rather than breaking up the herd and putting them through the capture technique and transportation, and so forth and so forth.
I would propose that getting to AML in 3 to 5 years is going to be a little too difficult. It's a nice goal, but I think we just need more time based on the numbers and the parameters within which BLM has to stay within, just based on how many they can physically remove every year. Maybe that can go a little bit up, but we have to kind of start at some level of assumption. And I would also propose that instead of on-range euthanasia, that any gather, anytime, even before AML is achieved, that we increase use of fertility control in all situations. And we may be able to greatly reduce or hopefully completely remove any idea of euthanasia on the range or anywhere for that matter. And I would be willing to model that out for you if you would like, though I probably can't do it by the end of this meeting.
Well, I think, in a perfect world, I think that would be great, but, it's our observations that we're in a critical tipping point here, that it's not like we have 3 or 5 or 10 years to fix this. I understand that it's going to take a long time, probably, but well before I joined this board, there's a lot of discussion throughout the horse industry about this issue, and we have continued to hear in a couple of years or in a few years, we're going to have something that will work, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think we have a few years. I think we need to get on the stick and make some really hard decisions, and these are hard decisions. I have no doubt everybody in this room loves horses, and a lot of us have devoted our entire life to improving their health and welfare. And so these are hard decisions that have to be made, and I think we need to that's what we're getting paid for, is to make those decisions and make the recommendations of BLM. So it's something I think we can discuss.
It is tough. It is tough, and we got to come up with some kind of answer. BLM has struggled with this. There's lots of folks have, and it's a tough thing. But the range, as we saw in our field trip, as we've heard from three what I can consider experts today, the range is at that probably past the point. Don't you agree, Ben, where some of the range is ever going to come back within? I'm older than you. It ain't gonna come back in my lifetime. Is it gonna come back in yours?
I hope so. But I mean, I spent 3 weeks in Nevada, and I can count the number of healthy meadow complexes I saw on HMAs in one hand.
And so, you know, it's kind of, you know, one of the things that I'm taking out from this meeting, and is the potential of this private partnership where, Celeste, you and I have talked about this, where instead of BLM having a long-term holding, the Return to Freedom group has a long-term holding, and they take over these horses, or the Cloud Foundation take over these horses, you know, something like that. I mean, I have Mustangs at home. I have my own Return to Freedom deal. I mean, I have Mustangs at home, you know, and so I'm doing my part. But anyway, that is one of the most exciting things I've taken away from here, and you know, but if this does not take effect, if we don't do something immediately. I mean, I'm serious. Immediately, they're in a severe drought here, and the other day, when we drove back from the range where we were at, where those horses was, when we drove to that valley of private land, and I could look at that range and look at the range we just left, it was just like the pictures we've seen, just like day and night. So coming up with an answer, coming up with an approach, you know, and you know, and I've always said that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one footstep, but we ain't even take any footsteps, and the journey is still up ahead of us, and we're talking about 3 to 5 years doing this A, B, and C. And Tom's got a point. You know, in 2016, this board made the recommendation that we impose the 1971 law as written. Ben was on that committee. Stephen was on that committee. Ginger was on that committee. Ginger did not agree, and she voted no, but 8 of the 9 members did, and that kind of brought things to the attention of what was going on. Now we haven't progressed since then. That's been 2 years. The population has grown more. We have more horses out there. Long-term and short-term holding, we have more horses than that. Our budget has gone down 5%. And I anticipate in the budget for 2019 and 2020 is going to be about the same. So coming up with a proposal and a plan to recommend to the Bureau of Land Management needs to take all this into consideration. There's not money to go ahead and increase long-term holding. There's not money to do all this. And so we got to come up with something that we can recommend that's feasible, that makes sense, and that is doable. That's a tough thing to do.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. I'm really excited about some of the options that have been presented here today from some of the animal welfare groups. I mean, you know, I'd like to see every horse out there end up in a happy place, right? But again, we're not there right now, and we need to make some hard decisions in the interest of the horses.
I've been around for a long time, coming to these meetings, and I remember not too long ago, John Fallon served on this board, and John Fallon is not inherently in the, you know, wild horse necessarily loving area, although I respect him greatly, and he was almost begging the BLM to increase the fertility control doses. He said 400 doses, what is that going to do? So when you have the past president of the Nevada Cattlemen's Association and also the advocacy community begging BLM to increase fertility control, you know something's very wrong. And I think this is a moral argument. Should our wild horses pay for the inaction, a long-term inaction of the government, when tools that were available were voluntarily not used? And I totally agree with Celeste that we've got to up the game. I totally agree with Nancy Perry that we've got to become much more aggressive, and perhaps it's not just PZP, but every mare that's captured is given PZP 22. And if they are then reapplied in a couple of years, science is indicating that it has very long durability and would render infertility. And Ben and I didn't even have a person in our volunteer group. So from a volunteer standpoint, I think there are a lot of people who stand ready to help. And that goes back to advertising and marketing. If people know where herds are and they admire them, they're going to be much more inclined to volunteer. And we need volunteers like crazy to carry out on the range management. But back to the moral question. Do you kill the horses because of a failure in management?
Can I make a couple comments?
Mr. Chairman,
Who's first?
I was going to sit on my hands on this one, but I can't. There's also I believe there's a greater moral issue as well, and that is should the native wildlife suffer that same fate? And inaction of any kind at this stage in the game is not only is assuring that, but it is also we are at a point, and I just have to keep coming back to Dr. Perryman on this thing. We are at a point where we're not talking about horses any longer. We're not talking about mule deer and pronghorn anymore. We're talking about the potential of the land to ever support those animals again. And I know that sounds doom and gloom, but I can tell you, I live in northern Nevada, and I absolutely agree with everything Mr. Masters just said, is that we are well past the point of no return in some habitats. We have places right now that we have literally lost major mule deer populations, literally lost them. We're in a position, we're not even talking about the neotropicals and the sagebrush obligate species that are dependent on those habitats that we haven't even measured at this point. And I cringe to think down the road what is going to be left. And so I guess I would say is that because we're at this point right now, we're going to have to look outside this box in terms of wondering how whether we're going to fertilize or going to fertility treatments on horses, or whether we're going to gather into long-term or short-term holding, or whether we're going to wonder how the policy shifts in policy are going to result in humane treatment of the horses. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating inhumane treatment of anything. I'm just saying is that we've finally gotten to a point to where any additional inaction is going to result in inhumane treatment of horses, and that is going to come in the form of starvation and in the form of loss of habitat and dying of thirst in Nevada in a lot of locations. We just heard yesterday about the number of emergency gathers that were conducted this year in just Nevada alone. And emergency gathers are just that. You're going to gather them or they're going to die right there in one spot. And many of them did die. Just the act of trying to put them in a truck, try to get them into one location to take them off the land where they were starving to death. Many of them perished as a result of that. But nobody wants to talk about what was left over after we pulled those horses off that piece of land, what was left for those indigenous wildlife they're faced with trying to overwinter in those locations this year. So I would just say that it is, I'm going to emphasize this one more time, and we're going to hear about it in terms of recommendations, but this is about habitat. This is about the ecosystem, and this is about what we, it's less about horses at this stage of the game. It's sad that we've gotten into a corner and to where that's all we can talk about now is we have to put the horses on the one side because it is about the habitat at this stage. I'll just leave it at that.
Stephen?
I would completely echo what you just said, Jim. This rangeland resource that the horses utilize is also utilized by a myriad of other animals, other species, not just mammals, invertebrates, and there's so much at stake here that we stand to lose. And once it's gone, Professor Peterson talked about it can take hundreds and even thousands of years to get back. I would argue in a lot of situations with all the introduced invasive species that we have now, I don't know if those thresholds can ever be overcome. So the carrying capacity, at least within our lifetimes, assuredly within our lifetimes, is removed, and the animals that utilize that for their winter range, for their summer range, now don't have that habitat available to them. And along with that, the horses themselves don't have that habitat. And I would argue that there are horses currently that are being abused inadvertently by the BLM, not by any choice of their own, but because their hands have been tied as to what they could do. And I think we need to do everything we can in our power as a board to not let that process continue to happen to an agency that has been given two very separate charges that are linked: the management of the land first and foremost, and the management of the horses. But first and foremost, we have to take care of the land so that it can take care of the horses, and we have to humanely do what is right for the horses. And sometimes it's a lot more humane for a horse to be euthanized than it is for it to starve to death or die of thirst. And that's all I'll say.
Thank you, Stephen.
Mr. Chairman.
Celeste?
I just want, oh, Barry's on?
Barry?
Go, Barry.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
I just need to weigh in for just a little bit too, to echo the latest things that have been said. And as I said yesterday, I think there's a non-lethal way out of this. I really do. If all of the parties are really interested in doing something for the benefit of horses, I think there's a non-lethal way out of this. But I have to say this, that it doesn't make sense to administer contraceptive to a dying mare. And we're down to the habitat. We're down to the face of it. If we don't control these numbers to the point where this habitat can be maintained to the future, we lose our options for the future. We lose them. We no longer have the option to have wildlife species, passerine birds out there, squeaky dogs, and other small mammals, and horses, and mule deer. If we lose the habitat, we no longer have those options. And they may be reduced options now in many of the HMAs. Now, and this is not true in all of the HMAs, but those critical ones that are just been abused for decades now, we can't afford to lose the options for the future. And if we sit around in inactivity, if we delay, the longer we delay, the higher the chances are that we're going to lose those options for the future. And it just, for me, it just doesn't make sense to administer contraceptive to a dying mare. It just doesn't play. I can't wrap my head around that. So with that said, I'll let you guys get back and I'll listen in a little bit more. Thank you.
Well, Barry, before you do that, you talked to us the other evening about the horses in long-term holding. Do you want to address that a little bit?
As far as sort of a non-lethal way out of this, is that what you're referring to?
Well, or a lethal way, whatever way you want to do it.
Okay. Well, there's already been some discussion this morning about, transferring the care or the responsibility of the care from the federal government to private entities or NGOs that may or may not exist right now at this moment. And I really do think that there are millions of people, both on an individual scale and on a foundational scale, that would be willing to contribute whatever is necessary, the time and energy and monetary means to taking care of these horses. These are drastic times, and I think if we make the case correctly, people, Americans are generous people, and they're concerned about their heritage, and I think they'll step up to the plate if they're presented with the opportunity in the appropriate way to take on this task of supporting animals in long-term holding facilities of one kind or another, various kinds. Maybe in somebody's backyard, they've got 2 or 3 or 1, and maybe there's long-term holding facilities that are, that have thousands of horses in them. But I think that's our way out of this thing, because we have got to get these horses off the range. There is no question about that. And so the question becomes, how do we manipulate them into various markets or various homes to compensate for that? Because we're up against it, and we know we're up against it. I just think that's the way out of it is through private and NGO type partnerships with BLM to transfer these horse care, these off-range horse care, over to that sector of the country. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense to me.
Get me?
Okay. Thank you, Barry. Celeste?
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's in Quaker circles where when you just agree with someone, you say, in the case of Barry, my brother speaks for me. I think it would be a bold and empowering move on behalf of this board to unify in a pretty big recommendation that doesn't include euthanasia, because we are stepping outside of the box. And we talked yesterday on our way to dinner sort of informally about how it's the energy in this room right now that is going to make it happen. These board members, these cattlemen's associations in here, these advocates, to continually say, just do it this way or this way because this is the way I like, isn't going to work. These are bigger, newer ideas, but without everyone getting behind it, they're going to fall flat just like all the ideas in the past. So I want to continue to advocate for this idea you first brought up being very much on the right track. If we can sort of broaden it, bigify it, if you will, I like to make up words, and get euthanasia off the table. I know that's not popular with everybody, but I think we still have a way out of it, and we need to pursue it, but that is not going to be easy.
Well, the one thing that I would recommend is that if that's something that you want the board to consider, then you consider the board's approach to applying spay techniques.
Oh, I knew you were going to say that.
Did you? Well, but you know where I'm at. So, the thing is, if we're going to use every tool, we need to use every tool. We don't need to just say, well, no, my way is the only way to do it, and so I don't want euthanasia and all this. So if we want every tool in the toolbox we can use, not only spaying, not only gilding, PZP, Gonacon, anything else new that comes up, every tool applied, because PZP is not the answer. You cannot use PZP in every herd. You cannot dart every and everybody said, well, we'll just gather them. We'll put them in a pen and we'll give them a shot, and then 2 weeks later we'll give them another shot. But you got to do that again. And these are wild horses. Them horses we saw out there in our field trip, they were not wild horses. They were wild horses. But they were not wild horses. When you can go up and a horse looks at you and walks over to you like you're going to give him something, that's not a wild horse. And so, you know, and we have to base this on the 10 states that is there. Every HMA is different. Every horse herd is different. We heard Gus say, them horses they hired, the mob, they are acclimated to humans. People go out there all the time. They are acclimated to seeing people. They don't get scared. But you go a little bit further, they see a truck and they run. So it's one of those things that, yeah, I mean, I have no problem with that, but I really have a problem with somebody saying my way or the highway. I really do. And so, you know, honestly, and I'm being very honest, I would not use PZP on my horses. I would not even consider using PZP on my horses. Would I spay my horses? I would in a heartbeat, because I don't want to put anything unnatural in my horse.
But you'll take it out.
Well, well, but you're talking about taking something that's pretty precious to me off of a male horse. I mean, well, I have a problem with that. So, you know, you want to be brutally honest, you know. I mean, it really, I mean, and I have helped Gail a whole bunch of horses, and it hurts me every time I do it. It does. And so, you know, so what you're saying, Celeste, is we're going to do that. We're going to take that big important part of that male horse and not do anything with it, but don't touch the girls.
Wait, I don't say that in terms of management.
You can help out with it. We're doing our lunchtime. We've got about 8 minutes.
Okay. All right. Go ahead. You through? You're done?
The defendant rests.
Oh, goodness.
I'd like to end this on a positive note, if I could.
Well, hallelujah.
You know, Dr. Perryman and I talked about this quite a bit last night, and I think he's spot on. And I said this at Grand Junction. I looked at everybody in that room and the energy in that room, some of it negative and some of it positive energy, but it was energy. And I do believe that is the solution to this problem. And I do, this morning, Nancy's presentation, it was, reminded me of something that I saw happen in my lifetime. And I can remember 1963. A lot of you folks don't remember, didn't see 1963, but I remember a small group of people out there that had an issue with the reduction in habitat for Rocky Mountain elk. And it had been reduced down. The general feeling at the time was that the elk populations had been reduced to about 4.5–5% of their original range. And that group of people, everybody told them the same thing we're hearing in here today. It's too big. This problem's big. We've got society's moved in. The technology has changed how elk are going to move around. Elk numbers are. We've got genetic issues with the elk, and you can't, you know, a whole range of discussions on that. But that group moved on, and they created an outfit called Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and that foundation right now is a well over $100 million a year prospect. They're buying ranches right now for elk habitat. They are in every state that has had historic elk populations right now. They have a presence there, and they made a difference. And I would just say that is the challenge that we have right here. Let's create a foundation, create those public, NGO, public government alliances. That would not just the federal government. I'm talking about state and local governments as well. If you look at what's going on in Utah right now, Nevada could learn from that example. And I really believe that is the solution to this thing. That does not, though, negate the fact that we've got a train wreck that we've inherited here. And that has to be, we have to deal with that, and we have to deal with it reasonably. Any decision we make that hinders the ability of the Bureau of Land Management to reduce numbers to AML quickly risks the prospect that we won't have an ecological system to support horses when we decide to expand our range later on down the road. And it is exactly that issue right now. So with that, I just implore everybody that if you've got an idea about it, if you've got a group that you represent, if you've got an idea relative to an NGO to take on these public-private partnerships, let's hear it. Let's do it, because this is our opportunity right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. At that, we're going to go ahead and break for lunch, and we will take back up at, let's say it's 12:45. Is that what you want to do? That's what we're scheduled? Okay, we'll take back up at 12:45. Thank you all.